So the Supreme Court has issued an order in a critical Second Amendment Preservation Act challenge that was pending in front of them. So let's talk about what has happened in this case and what happens now going forward. Now, before we jump into this video, if you guys want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply subscribing to the channel. It helps the channel to grow. Also, double check to make sure YouTube is not unsubscribed to you. They definitely love to do that, especially on two-way channels. I also want to thank the sponsor of this video, which is the Wellness Company. If you feel foggy, drained, or stuck in low gear, you may want to try TWC's Recharge Kit. Your brain and body run on cellular energy, and when your mitochondria slows down, so do you. TWC's Recharge Kit is the first ever formula combining NAD+, methylene blue, and PQQ in one powerful daily supplement. This triple threat formula is backed by TWC's Chief Medical Board and designed to give you real-world results. So you can feel the difference with enhanced mental clarity, sustained energy, sharper focus, and protection against cognitive decline. And no, it won't turn your tongue blue. It's simply you take 2 tablets each morning and you ignite your peak performance in your brain and body function. So if you're interested, head over to twc.health/scholar and you can use code SCHOLAR to get 10% off plus free shipping. Now, as I mentioned in the intro, in this video, we're going to be talking about a huge Second Amendment protection case that was seeking Supreme Court emergency review. This is a case that we've talked about before, and it deals with a state's Second Amendment Preservation Act, also known as a SAPA law. We have discussed this case before because in the past, the Supreme Court issued an 8-1 order denying an emergency stay, which would have protected Missouri's SAPA law. This case went back in front of the Supreme Court, and recently we got an answer from the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, in a recent order list, denied emergency review to this Missouri SAPA challenge. Now, you might remember that in this case, the Trump administration continued to argue that the SAPA law here in the state is invalid in some of its applications and that the Supreme Court should deny review to the case. However, at the same time, they also stated that if the court denied review to this case and sent it back down to the lower court, the government here would release some of the judgments that they received prior, essentially that the Biden administration got from the lower court. This new Trump administration, when it got back in the hands of the district court, would release some of that judgment. Now, Missouri responded by pointing out that the concession here made by the Trump DOJ is exactly why the Supreme Court should grant review to this case. This went to conference on September 29th, and then after that, we got an order from the Supreme Court. And ultimately, the Supreme Court decided to deny review to this emergency case, and instead, this is going to head back down to the lower court, but there is still some things that can happen and develop in this case, which could be favorable for Missouri's SAPA law. Now, if you're not aware, this lawsuit revolves around a 2021 Second Amendment Preservation Act that was passed in Missouri. That law set the state's interpretation of the Second Amendment and set restrictions on the support and funding that the state would provide to federal agencies in their attempts to enforce federal laws that the state believed violated the Second Amendment. Now, the law prohibits Missouri's officers, agents, and government officials from helping federal agents who are attempting to enforce those inconsistent laws. The law also created a civil remedy where anyone in the state of Missouri could sue a Missouri official if they help to enforce those federal laws, which the state believes violates the Second Amendment. So the law aimed to give the true enforcement powers to the residents, to the citizens in the state of Missouri, instead of the state or its officers or agents. Now, in this Missouri case, the district court on review ruled in favor of the then Biden administration, striking down the Missouri Preservation Act in its entirety. So there was a universal injunction that was put in place on this law. Now, in response, the state of Missouri then appealed to the 8th Circuit, and Missouri at that time wanted a temporary stay on that universal injunction that was issued by the lower court, and this eventually led them to seek emergency Supreme Court intervention. However, at that time, on review, the Supreme Court issued an 8-1 order denying that emergency relief. Only Justice Thomas was in favor of stepping in and granting that emergency stay. Now, after that 8-1 order denying the emergency relief, this went back in the hands of the 8th Circuit, and they heard oral arguments on this case and then issued a ruling. The 8th Circuit ultimately ruled in favor of the federal government, striking down the SAPA law once again entirely. But now Missouri filed their writ of cert and was asking for the Supreme Court to step in and re-review that issue. Now, one of the big things that Missouri pointed out in this request was that the 8th Circuit essentially said that the structure and operation of this law was valid, but they ultimately struck it down because they did not like the underlying Second Amendment purpose. Missouri argued that the 8th Circuit went against clear precedent and found that state officials could be sued because the court believed that the state played some role in enforcement by simply complying with the state law. Essentially here, the Eighth Circuit found that compliance and non-action was actual enforcement in action. Now, this case and law was originally opposed by the Biden administration, but now the Trump administration had to control the case, and initially, the Trump DOJ stalled out their response for multiple months, and recently we got their answer in the case, and in that response, the Trump administration continued to argue that the SAPA law is invalid and that the lower court got the ruling right. However, at the same time, they argued to the Supreme Court that if the Supreme Court denied review to this case and it got back in the hands of the district court, the federal government here, the Trump DOJ, would ultimately dismiss some of the universal injunction that they got in their favor. They argued in the response that having reevaluated this case, the United States has concerns about whether the judgment below extends too far and enjoins applications of the act that do constitute mere non-enforcement of federal law protected under the anti-commandeering doctrine. And those concerns are exacerbated by the uncertainty in this pre-enforcement posture about how certain provisions of the act will be applied and about whether the provisions on which the Eighth Circuit focused is indeed inseparable from the rest of the act. Given those concerns, the United States has decided that it would acquiesce in narrowing the scope of the judgment. So after stalling the case for a few months, the Trump DOJ decided to respond by continuing to argue that the SAPA law is invalid and that the Supreme Court should deny review to the case. However, at the same time, they said that if this was denied and got in the hands of the district court, they would release some of that universal injunction. However, recently we got an order from the Supreme Court on their order list, and they denied emergency review to the SAPA case. Despite that denial in this case, I will state that this case is not done yet, and it still is going to move forward. As the U.S. stated in their request for the denial, once this got back in the hands of the district court, they would be releasing some of the total preliminary injunction that was issued in their favor against the Missouri SAPA law. So there may be some ways in which the SAPA law will be implemented. Since this was a pre-enforcement challenge, maybe they're going to let some of this go into effect, maybe see how this plays out, see if some of the provisions are severable from the rest and kind of see how this operates. At least that's what the DOJ was potentially hinting at by saying that they were going to release some of the universal block that was issued by the lower court. So even though the Supreme Court denied emergency review to this case, it will move forward at the lower court level in the Western District of Missouri. And the Supreme Court will send this back down to the Western District, and then we're going to see how that district court decides to respond to this case. The Trump DOJ claims that they will be releasing some of the judgment that the Biden administration got in their favor. So ultimately, we're going to see how that happens in the lower court, and then potentially if the lower court will even allow that to happen. So ultimately, the Supreme Court once again denied emergency review to this case and denied getting involved with the SAPA issue, but there's still hope and positive movement in favor of keeping some of the Missouri SAPA law in place and maybe seeing how some of it can be put in place. Again, this was kind of pre-enforcement. It was not allowed to fully go into effect. And so here, there seems to be some sort of movement by the Trump DOJ to say, okay, let's let some of this maybe go into place, see how it operates. Is it severable? Is some of the parts that the lower court had issues with, are those true issues? And we'll see kind of how this plays out. So unfortunately, that's what happened in this case. But like I mentioned, this is going to move back in the hands of the lower court. The Trump DOJ says that they're going to release some of that judgment. And then we're ultimately going to see, what impact does that have on this Missouri SAPA law. So as we get more information, as it develops more, I will let you guys know. If you like this video and you would like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that, of course, is to subscribe to the channel. Also, you can check out my website, armscholar.com. Over there, we have a lot for you guys if you want to check that out, channel merch and other things like that. But as always, thank you guys so much for all of your support. And never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.